All right, so we're going to spend a little time talking about the frontal lobe, which is actually one of the favorite things that I think about and talk about. And this fascination with the frontal lobe really started when I was in my residency training because I was, like I mentioned in my first talk, discouraged, with the whole approach to mental health, a pill for every ill. And so I said, you know what? How can we understand better what the underlying root issues are when it comes to mental illness? And so I started doing some research and looking at different research articles, and I had a senior project to do, a grand rounds presentation to all the psychiatrists and all the residents and even some of the therapists and everything. And so I was trying to figure out what topic, and I thought, it would be really fitting, I think, to look into this holistic approach. And so I was trying to figure out, so what are the things that will actually optimize mental health and all of that? And I started to realize that as I was looking through the literature on holistic treatments, that when you deal with the frontal lobe, that you can really address any mental disorder. Now, that doesn't mean it's just going to cure any mental disorder. But what I realized very quickly is that all mental health problems have frontal lobe deficits, okay? So what that means is that whenever we address the frontal lobe and improve the frontal lobe functioning, then we can improve any mental disorder. And that's why this topic is actually really important. When you think about the frontal lobe, it's actually the most complex part of our whole body. I mean, it's like the CEO of the brain and really the whole body. It's a part of the being where we really connect and communicate in a deep way with God. So it's a very, very important. And so what's interesting is when we learn to take care of our frontal lobe and we learn what's best for our frontal lobe, guess what? We're actually going to do what's best for the rest of the body too. In other words, what's best for the frontal lobe will also make our heart function optimally. It'll also, decrease our risk of developing diabetes and cancer and all these. And so if we think about the most complex part of our body and we learn to take care of that, everything else follows suit. So I hope you can understand why this is important. So like I mentioned, frontal lobe dysfunction has been noted in almost every psychiatric disorder. I actually can't think of one specifically that I've found where there's not some level of frontal lobe dysfunction. Problems arise when the frontal lobe is out of balance with the limbic system. Well, what does that mean? Basically, what that means is in mental illness, you have underactivity or malactivity in the frontal lobe. And then, generally speaking, you have overactivity in the limbic system. What does the limbic system do? Feelings, emotions, right? So you have overactivity of the emotional part of your brain and underactivity of the logical part of your brain. And so it's this imbalance that creates big problems. And it's very interesting because there's so many complexities when it comes to neuroanatomy and neurophysiology. But what I tell my patients, and even the way I think about it, is very simple. And it's exactly what Ellen White said, over 100 years ago, that we have a higher center of the mind and a lower center of the mind. That's really all we need to, and I shouldn't say all, but to understand the basics. That's all we need to understand. Very simple, right? And what's interesting is that this higher center of the mind and the lower center of the mind communicates with one another. Okay, so let me give you a simple example. Let's say that you heard a very loud bang outside. So what would happen there is you have the limbic center, especially the amygdala, and also the hypothalamus would send out these alarm signals and say, like, watch out, something's going on, right? That's your startle response. And so, of course, your startle response sends signals then to your body. That's where you get like the adrenaline released, et cetera. And so then you're feeling like, oh, what happened? Like the adrenaline's released, you're feeling a little shaky. But it also sends signals not only to your body, but it also sends signals to your frontal lobe saying, hey, something's going on here. Pay attention, there could be danger. And then it's your frontal lobe's job to assess. So you look over there, that's that natural like orienting response, right? You look over there and it's like, okay, is there danger here? And the frontal lobe has to decide, is there actually danger here? Now let's say that was just a car backfiring. Is that dangerous for you? No, right? So then in that case, the frontal lobe says, oh, that was just a car backfiring, sends a signal back to the emotional part of your brain and says, false alarm, calm down, let's carry on with our day. That's the way it's supposed to work. But what if you had an anxiety disorder, like maybe PTSD, for example? What would that then look like? Well, like I said, you have an imbalance there. So you already have hyperactivity of the emotional part of your brain, underactivity of the frontal lobe. So what happens there? So then you look over and you're like, okay, yeah, no danger. Your frontal lobe tries to send that signal back to the emotional part of your brain saying, calm down, everything's fine, carry on with your day. But with something like PTSD, you're already so hyped up and the frontal lobe is not sending a very loud signal back to the emotional part of your brain, so the emotional brain continues to freak out. And that's why a lot of people with PTSD, for example, they can be triggered and they know logically like, hey, this shouldn't be a big deal, but they can't shut it down because their frontal lobe is so weak and their emotions are already so heightened. Take depression is another good example. Let's say that you're already feeling depressed, you're having that hyperactivity in the emotional part of your brain, a lot of rumination, negative attribution, bias, etc. And you go outside and you're walking down the street and you see someone scowl at you. And you're like, oh yeah, see, I know that person knows how stupid I am and they probably see how ugly I am. So you have that negativity already and that person scowling at you, you automatically think negative thoughts, that's confirming all this negativity. And even though part of your brain, the frontal lobe might be trying to say, wait a minute, that might not be entirely true. Maybe they're having a bad day themselves and maybe it has nothing to do with you. But because the emotions are already so heightened, the frontal lobe can't shut down that negativity and that rumination. Does that make sense? So another analogy that I like to kind of use, which I think helps a lot of people, is the idea of kind of parents and kids. So think about it this way. So the frontal lobe is supposed to be kind of like the good parent, right? And the kids are kind of like the emotions. Now, are kids inherently bad? Meaning, yeah, we love kids, right? I love my kids, but boy, they can be a handful, right? So have you ever been in a household where the kids seems like they're running the house? Is that a relaxing, good place to be? No. But that's exactly what happens for a lot of us with our mental health. In other words, it's like the kids, our emotions, are running the house instead of the frontal lobe, the parents being in control. You see? So what do we want to do? Do we want to get rid of the kids? No. Just like we don't want to get rid of the emotions are not inherently bad. Even emotions like sadness, anger, anxiety have their place. But we don't want them to actually control our lives. We just need to train them. Does that make sense? And we need to empower the parents so that they can get a handle on their kids. Okay? So I hope that kind of gives some context why this actually does matter. So what is a frontal lobe responsible for? Well, a frontal lobe is responsible for decision making, emotional regulation. And you could ask yourself how well your frontal lobe is doing by asking yourself, like, how good are my decisions? And not just how good are they, how difficult is it for me to even make a decision? I have a lot of patients that I deal with, they have a hard time weighing the pros and cons and figuring out what I should decide, and they get so confused that they can't even make a decision, and they get analysis paralysis, and they just feel overwhelmed. Emotional regulation. Are my emotions regulating me? Again, are the kids in control, or am I actually really able to manage those appropriately? Impulse control. Am I able to say no to things that I should be saying no to, or do I take, the third, the fourth, the 10th cookie out of that jar? And what about thought regulation? This is actually a really important aspect. A lot of us allow our thoughts to just run away from us, and that it actually has to do with frontal lobe capacity as well. And then awareness. So this is really important when you think about our ability to actually, we can be aware of not only what we're feeling and experiencing, but also how we're coming across with others. And this is an important part of emotional intelligence, right? In other words, how are my interactions with other people? How am I coming across? Do they understand what I'm saying? Am I talking too much? Am I talking enough? So this is actually a really key component of frontal lobe function. And then concentration is another really important element as well. So just as a brief overview, habits that damage the frontal lobe: addiction, chronic stress, media overuse, damaging music, and bitterness. And we're going to be touching on all of these a little bit. We're really going to be diving into the media piece a little bit more deeply, and then also the stress element, because these are two of the common things that I think are often overlooked as far as the effect on the frontal lobe. And then habits that strengthen the frontal lobe: exercise, nutrition, sleep, self-control, gratitude, stress management, rest, and forgiveness. So let's start by talking about stress. So we all deal with stress, right? Can any of you eliminate stress from your life? Not lately. And we're going to talk about how that's not necessarily a bad thing. Actually, acute stress is not all bad, but we need to understand how it affects us. So acute mild stress impairs frontal lobe function. It actually increases activity of the amygdala and the hippocampus. Now, this is interesting, right? The hippocampus. What does the hippocampus have to do with? Memory. Some of you have well-working hippocampi. That's very good. So yes, the hippocampus actually helps to process and then sends the memories out to long-term storage, okay? And what's interesting is that the hippocampus is right next door to the amygdala. And this makes sense, right? Because amygdala has to do with emotion, especially fear-based processing. And so when we think about that, we realize, well, what do you tend to remember better? You tend to remember a boring math lecture, or maybe your first kiss better. Right? So something that is much more emotionally laden is going to be seared into your memory because those structures are very close to each other. That's part of the reason. So examples: studying for a test. I'm going to give you that acute test, and that acute stress. And again, that's not all bad, right? Because that stress can push you to study harder. And remember, it activates the hippocampus, so that can actually help with some short-term memory recall. It's not the best way to remember things long-term when you're just cramming for a test, but it can help in the short term. Public speaking. So this is something where maybe some of you have gotten up in front and then you're like, oh, I thought I knew exactly what I was going to say, and you just kind of freeze or draw a blank. What's happening there? Well, what's happening there is that your frontal lobe is actually shutting down, okay? And I remember very clearly, I've not always been a public speaker. I used to be kind of terrified of it. Actually, when I was a teenager, yeah, I remember getting up in front of my dad's church, and it was just like shaking in my boots or my Sabbath shoes or whatever. And I got up there, and my mind went completely blank. And that's exactly what happened. I stuttered something out and got off the stage as quickly as I possibly could. So what happens there is that frontal lobe tasks are impaired, but what actually gets enhanced? Ingrained habits become spared or enhanced. Now this is, again, very interesting, because what we need to understand here is that this does not need to be all bad. What's important, though, is what? What's important here when we're dealing with stress? Yes, but also what is our habits? So are habits good or bad? Think about this. Like, let's say there's a police officer or a firefighter, and they're called to the scene of an accident. Do you think they're stressed out? Yes, they're stressed out. And so their frontal lobes are not actually fully engaged, but are they still able to do the right thing? Because of habit, because they've done what? They've trained doing the right thing over and over and over again. And there's examples of people that actually can perform better under stress because they've practiced doing the right thing over and over again. Think about some of these basketball players, right? Like Michael Jordan, Kobe Bryant, etc. These guys, they practice so much in practice, in game time, under clutch, difficult situations, they often were able to do things they could have never pulled off in practice. Does that make sense? Because that adrenaline and all of that, even though their frontal lobes were like kind of shut down and they're stressed, they had practiced so much, and then that extra adrenaline actually gave them an extra edge and pushed them even beyond. But what happens if our habits aren't so good? This is where it gets dangerous, right? And we get a lot of patients who they'll come into our intensive outpatient program and they'll be getting that extra support, and they're like, okay, you know what? I'm doing really well. I got this. I'm not smoking anymore, or I'm not using alcohol anymore. And they do really well for a couple weeks when they have that extra support and their stress level is low. But then what happens when they get in a major fight with their partner, or their dog dies, or some other stressor? Okay, so what happens is frontal lobe shuts down, right? And the habits kick in, and that's when they're prone to relapse. And then they beat themselves up. And they say, oh man, I'm never going to get this. I might as well give up because I was doing so well, but then I always fail. And so they just want to give up. But what do we tell them? We say, you know what? No. It's just that the new habit, look, you've been drinking for 20 years. And you expect that 2 weeks are going to make that new habit of not drinking and doing something else stronger than the old habit? No. What you need to do is just realize that you got to just get back on the wagon and just keep practicing the new habit. And by the way, when I say new habit, I'm not talking about just not drinking, but you got to replace the negative habit with something better, right? That was Christ's method. Christ always replaced, he didn't just say, he didn't run around and say, don't do this, don't do this, don't do this. He actually had very little focus on what not to do. Christ's primary focus was where? On what you should do, right? And so we tell them, no, you just need to get back on the wagon. Instead of beating yourself up, just get back on the wagon and do what's right. And pretty soon that new habit will get stronger than the old habit. Does that make sense? I mean, think about a baby, right? A baby, when they're learning to walk, do they fall? Yeah, but does the baby get up and or just sit there on the floor and say, oh, I'm such a stupid baby. I'm never going to get this. I might as well give up walking. No, that would be, they don't even think about it. They just get back up and they just keep trying, and pretty soon they got it. So in the process of change, people are going to fail. They're going to fall. And sometimes people, they're done, they quit, and that's it. That's wonderful. But that's the exception, not the rule, right? In the process of change, we're going to make failures. But that's okay. We just get back up and we move on. We don't waste our time shaming ourselves or being upset with ourselves. We just say, hey, what can I learn from that? What can I do better next time? Let's move on. So again, acute stress, here's someone that had a eating problem, can lead to that loss of self-control, that relapse into maladaptive behavior. And essentially what's happening in the brain, this is a diagram that shows here, you can see with non-stress conditions, you have that bottom or that top-down control with the frontal lobe in control, and then the amygdala control in stress conditions, okay? So, by the way, what are some of the things that are contributing to stress in Americans? So, number one, too many responsibilities overall. Does anyone resonate with that? Oh man, yeah, I'm definitely raising my hand to that. It's stressful, right? There's a lot that we juggle. Problems with finances, work problems, health problems for people in the immediate family, problems with family members, and being unhappy with the way you look. That made it in the top, let's see, 1, 2, 3, 7. Number 7. All right, and then let's talk about chronic stress. So chronic stress is different than acute stress. What's the difference between acute and chronic stress? Yeah, that's right. Short and long, right? So acute stress, short term, chronic stress goes on and on for weeks. And, you know, I would say that we would be safe to say it's something that lasts at least a week. And a lot of studies show that it does vary from person to person, probably even species. But we'll say, to be safe, it's going to have to last at least a week. And what's interesting about chronic stress is that it really becomes very toxic to the brain and the body. So, acute elevation of cortisol gets such a bad rap, right? Cortisol, everyone's like, cortisol is bad, bad, bad. Is cortisol bad? No, it's actually an important part of our body. It's super anti-inflammatory, helps regulate the immune system. But the problem is when we have that chronic elevation of cortisol, right? Then you actually start getting the breakdown of the immune system. Then you start getting nerve cells being killed off, both in your frontal lobe and especially in your, where? Hippocampus. And this is why a lot of my patients that are young people, and when I say young, I'm in my 40s now, so I'm like 40s, 50s. I used to think young was like 20s, 30s, right? It's interesting how age is so relative. But anyway, they will complain of significant memory problems. Am I getting some kind of early dementia? No, you're just what? Chronically stressed. See this very frequently. We live in a very high stress society. So again, it's stress lasting for weeks. God has given us a beautiful antidote for stress that lasts for weeks. What is that? It's actually the Sabbath. God he doesn't want us to experience chronic stress. And when we actually follow the Sabbath the way that God meant us to implement the Sabbath in our lives, it hits the stress reset button. It actually allows that stress level to come down. Now, that doesn't mean when I have Sabbath, it doesn't mean that these thoughts don't pop into my mind about like, oh, I have that presentation to prepare for next week, or man, that issue that I need to take care of with my house is still there, or whatever it might be, right? There's stressors don't go away. The thoughts don't still come in. But on the Sabbath, what do? I say, you know what? I am acknowledging that it's there, but I'm putting it on the shelf. And I say, Lord, I know you're going to help me take care of this next week. And it's a wonderful thing because not only does it help with the overall stress level, it actually helps us to redevelop a sense of control in our lives again. Because now we're actually training our minds to, instead of our thoughts and our emotions just taking over control, we're saying, okay, let me be intentional with, instead of just ignoring that it's there, I'm acknowledging that it comes in, but then with God's help, I'm saying, Lord, help me to put this on the shelf or put it in your hands until next week. And even then, we're going to do this together, right? And so on the Sabbath, what are we doing? We're doing things that really help us develop that sense of connection, of course, with God, but then also with one another, connecting with nature, slowing everything down. And what I would say is that we do not have the time not to take the time for the Sabbath. It makes us so much more efficient the next day or the next week. We get way more done. And it's not just from a logistical standpoint because my brain is working better. Yes, that is a big part of it, but it's also because God's blessing attends that. Because by faith, we're resting. All right, so what about substance use disorders? So substance use disorders also trigger frontal lobe issues because what you see here is you get excessive dopamine signaling in both the emotional and the frontal areas of the brain. So basically, you have a dopamine hit whenever you engage in a substance, whether it was cocaine or even nicotine, alcohol, and even benzodiazepines will give you some dopamine, even though these are stimulate the GABA receptor, there's also dopamine that's being released. So anything addictive is going to stimulate dopamine. And so what happens when you get that dopamine overshoot is that it will signal right here in the nucleus accumbens. And the nucleus accumbens is, again, part of that limbic area. And so you get that dopamine hit there, and the nucleus accumbens is what gives you that sense of a high. So that rush. So that's kind of that, if you have that sense of euphoria, and that part of the brain will be like, yeah, that was awesome, let's do it again, right? And that's what happens, and that's why people want to keep doing addictive substances. But then what happens, you also get a bunch of dopamine in the frontal lobe, and in the frontal lobe, excess dopamine actually shuts down the frontal lobe. Okay? So you want to have enough dopamine there, but you don't want to have too much. If you don't have enough, then you'll get bored and you'll fall asleep. Okay? But if you have too much, the frontal lobe will actually shut down. So you want to hit that sweet spot in the middle. So then the emotions are like, yeah, let's do it again. And the frontal lobe is like, no, don't do it. It's a bad idea. Who's going to win that argument? The louder one. And now you can see why it's so difficult to get out of addiction, right? Because you have your emotions yelling for more, and your frontal lobe is weak and unable to really corral those runaway habits and emotions. And this is why, to get out of an addictive pattern, we need to actually purchase an external frontal lobe. Except for they haven't developed those yet, right? So what do we do instead? How do we get our external frontal lobe? That's right. We ask God, and we also ask someone like Dr. Riesenberger, or in other words, someone else to help me, to be accountable, to support me. And yes, the Lord is, of course, the number one support, but he also works through and uses people like you and I to be external frontal lobes to help each other, right? And this is actually a beautiful thing, because it shows us that there's an opportunity when someone's struggling with addiction. If they're willing to accept help, they can actually get help. All right, and here is a quote from Mayo Clinic that says, as neuroscience further elucidates addiction's neural underpinnings, it becomes increasingly clear that a malfunctioning reward center is common to all compulsive behaviors, whether drug abuse, overeating, gambling, self-mutilation, or excessive sexual activity. So what it's saying there is it doesn't matter what addiction it is. It doesn't have to be a substance addiction. It can be a behavioral addiction. It can be a sexual addiction. It can be even a cutting addiction. That's an addiction. Did you know that? Cutting and burning yourself. We have to treat these all as addictions, and that's where we actually see the best results. And again, same sort of imbalance happens. You get overactivity of the emotional part of your brain, underactivity of the frontal lobe. Media overuse. Now, electronic media can actually be highly addictive. Like illicit drugs, media overuse, meaning with entertainment media, hijacks the brain's reward system, damages the frontal lobe and impairs decision-making, reduces concentration and focus, diminishes ability to empathize and connect with others, and diminishes life's simple pleasures. And we're going to unpack that a little bit more. Just to give you an idea, as far as U.S. adults' daily media time in 2021, here we see with mobile non-voice use over 4 hours on average, and then TV is over 3 hours, and then of course we have radio, other connected devices, desktop, laptop, internet activities. So, I mean, this all adds up very quickly, right? I mean, how many hours are we looking at here? Yeah, it's a full-time job. I mean, it's over 8 hours that we're actually looking at here. And when you count everything out separately, you start realizing, like, well, because sometimes people are multitasking, right? So they're like listening to the radio while they're doing this, and And that actually makes things even worse when you're trying to do two digital devices. But anyway, it's a lot of hours, okay? The average American watches about 3 hours a day of TV and movies. Again, frontal lobe activity does become impaired. The mind becomes very suggestible, temporary relaxation followed by depressed mood. So there are actually studies that show people's mood will improve while they watch TV. It will get a little bit better. Just like your mood will improve also if you do a drug, right? But then afterwards, the mood actually worsens. And you go through basically a mild withdrawal. It's just milder, so you don't notice it as dramatically. But over time, this can have a very negative effect. Plus, when you think about the frontal lobe, what does the frontal lobe have to do with? It has to do with critically evaluating the information that's going in. So if our frontal lobe is actually largely compromised when we're watching TV or movies or entertainment media in general, what's happening there? Are we able to critically evaluate what's coming in? No, not very well, right? And so if we're not critically evaluating what's coming in and all this stuff is coming in and still being stored, what's happening? We're literally being brainwashed. Does that make sense? So all this stuff is being stored and we don't realize how much that affects us. But guess what? Advertisers do. I mean, think about it this way. Let's say, for example, that you're going to the store and you're hungry. You're not thinking about the latest commercials about food, but there you come to the cashier and you see a bunch of candy bars there, and you see that Snickers bar. You're like, your subconscious mind is starting to prime you. Oh yeah, Snickers. Yeah, it really what? Satisfies, right? Yeah, impulse control. And so what happens is there's cues, emotional cues, that will actually start, because even though our frontal lobe makes that ultimate decision, our frontal lobe can be so heavily influenced by our emotions and our subconscious cues that it makes it virtually impossible, if it were not for the grace of God, to make a different decision. Because again, all that information gets stored, and then we're primed. We're like, oh yeah, and again, we're not consciously thinking of that commercial, but our subconscious mind is remembering that and influencing our feelings and our motivations, and then priming us to actually make that buying decision. Yeah. So we have to be so careful about what we allow into our minds. Because that same scenario plays out not just with Snickers, but with all sorts of things, right? How we interact in our relationships. How do we learn to interact with one another? Well, a big part of that is by observing how other people interact with one another. Of course, when we're little kids, we especially learn it from our parents, from our family dynamics. But if, as little kids, we're spending a lot of time watching TV, guess where we're learning a lot of that? And what about our values, right? Is it okay to have sexual relations outside of marriage? But the Hollywood says it's just fine. Is it okay to drink until or is drinking alcohol actually a very nice status symbol? And so you see, there's so many messages that get programmed into our brain and then literally will hugely affect our choices that we make day to day. And again, a lot of that is strengthened and enhanced because we're not able to critically evaluate what's coming in. We're just being brainwashed. Video games. Gaming addiction increases depression, anxiety, and social isolation. There is actually even a DSM criteria or disorder now. Internet gaming use disorder, I believe. And there's very clear evidence in the literature that shows that it actually worsens mental health. It strengthens those limbic brain, the activity there, and weakens the frontal lobe. And it actually increases irritability and aggressive thoughts. So some people point out and they say, wait. Studies don't show an increase in violence. And to some degree, that is true. But when you look at hostility, on the other hand, that's different. So yeah, most people that play violent video games aren't going to go out and shoot somebody, okay? We have isolated cases of that. But no, for the most part, no, right? But what will they? They will become more aggressive. In other words, they will become maybe just more obstinate, more irritable, right? Acting out more. So these are the sorts of things that we start seeing. Pornography is highly, highly addictive. This gives a super dopamine stimulus to people. It can lead to anxiety, depression, sexual dysfunction, relationship problems, and suicidal ideation. Pornography rewires the brain to a less mature, more juvenile state. No amount of pornography is safe or healthy, and there's no shame in getting help. And this is a big problem even in our church. It's so important to realize this is an addiction. And it literally, studies actually show that there's parts of the brain, including the frontal lobe, that actually atrophy, and even parts of the reward system that starts to atrophy. So you would think with limbic system hyperactivity that there would be larger limbic system, but no, what actually happens is the reward center will start downregulating because it's saying we're getting too much activity here. And then guess what happens? Let's say now you basically get numb to real life rewards. So a real life relationship is boring. A sunset, interactions with other people, having tea with a friend or whatever, it's just like, whatever. You lose that. And similar sort of process can happen with any of these things, where when you're getting overstimulation, the regular slow pace of the real world becomes very boring and dull. And this is a big part of why people are losing more concentration, because it's just, they're used to that hyper stimulation all the time. Excessive media use is harmful for everyone, but kids are especially vulnerable. Excess screen time impairs normal development, and there's studies that show increased likelihood of ADHD, and then also there often are anxiety and depressive disorders that develop as well. Screen time recommendations: 0 screen time for children under 2, and then after 5, you want to, at most, 1 hour of supervised use. And even then, it's like, what do they really need to be doing on, I'm just giving that 1 hour because that's where the research shows the cutoff, where after 1 hour of regular use of entertainment media per day, that's where they really start having more mental health problems. But again, I just think we should really minimize as much as possible. And here we see, look at this, depressive symptoms and internet hours and social media use. Do you see how all of those skyrocketed right after 2009, 10, 11? Well, especially right in 11 and 11, 12. Do you know what happened? What happened? That's right. So 2012 was the year that more than 50% of Americans started owning a smartphone. Isn't that interesting? And that correlates very well, doesn't it? Yeah, accessibility, right? So, and now well over 50% of young people, of kids, have a smartphone. And so, yeah. Jean Twenge, she's done a lot of research on this, and I like her reasoning through this process, because she's saying why the dramatic rise in mental health problems in our young people. We can apply a 2-part test to possible causes. Number 1, it must be correlated with mental health issues or unhappiness. And number 2, it must have changed at the same time and in the correct direction. TV watching is linked to depression, but teens watch less TV now than they used to, so that fails test number 2, right? Time spent on exercise and sports is linked to less depression, but it didn't change much since 2012, so they fail test number 2 as well. So it's not that people are actually getting less exercise and sports. So what is it? Only 3 activities pass both tests. Number 1, new media screen time is linked to mental health issues and arose at the same time. Number 2, in-person social interaction. And number 3, print media are linked to less unhappiness and less depression, and both have declined at the same time. A plausible theory includes 3 possible causes. Number 1, more screen time has led directly to more unhappiness and depression. Number 2, more screen time has led to less in-person social interaction, which then led to unhappiness and depression. Number 3, more screen time has led to less print media use, leading to unhappiness and depression. In the end, all mechanisms come back to what? To new media screen time in one way or another. And that's really what we see, right? With the advent of just ubiquitous technology, especially in the form of the iPhone, or, well, any smartphone for that matter. Attention spans have decreased significantly since the smartphone era began. Media addiction has a similar effect to ADD and ADHD. And interestingly enough, the ability to focus is directly correlated with proximity to our smartphone. So look at this study. They actually took 520 students and they gave them 2 tests on intellectual acuity. The only variable was the location of their smartphones. One was on one group had it on the desk, and then they also had it, another group in the pocket or handbag, and then another group in a different room. And so what was interesting is that the subjects with phones in view, where they could see them, had the worst scores. Out of sight, best, or out of the room, I should have said, was the best scores, actually. And then the ones that were just in a pocket were in the middle. So they couldn't see it, but it was still, close to them. And yeah, that's right. That's right. Out of the room was the best. That's right. Out of the room was the best. So I did a typo there. Nearly all said that their phones hadn't been a distraction, right? And this is the interesting thing with, remember, the frontal lobe has to do with awareness, right? But when our frontal lobe is suppressed, we cannot be aware of how much a digital device is actually distracting us. Does that make sense? So oftentimes the people that think digital devices are the least distracting are actually the ones that are distracted the most by digital devices. Yeah. Digital multitasking. Brain scans showed that people that spent more time on multiple devices, like with their phone and their computer, for example, at one time had less brain density in the anterior cingulate cortex. And this is a part of the brain that's important for empathy and cognitive emotional control. So multitasking really makes things a lot more difficult. There actually is no true multitasking. Our brain is just learning to switch very rapidly back and forth between different tasks. And what that does is it actually creates this climate of distraction, and it takes energy every time we focus from one thing to another thing. And so that actually wears out our brain. It makes it more difficult to concentrate, and then plus, our brain literally starts to change over time. And there are even some studies that are showing that high-speed media content exposure in childhood could contribute to ADD and decrease concentration and memory, due in large part by pruning neuronal tracts in the frontal cortex. So this is a scary thing, right? Because if you're not using, well, what do they say? If you don't use it, you lose it, right? And so there's pruning that seems to start taking place if you're not engaged in activities that actually on a regular basis that help you focus and you are inundated with media. Children may actually learn more from devices than from their parents and tend to trust devices over parents. Why is that? Because, well, if I want to know the height of Mount Everest and maybe dad doesn't know that, then what do? I just ask Google, right? And so they get trained, and I have to be careful of this even in my own family. It's like, We'll just look it up. It's like, oh man, how do we get around that, right? But we have to give them that example of not using, of how we use our digital devices too, because when parents use devices, children tend to use theirs even more. Ah, yeah, yeah. That actually is a very good point, because there are a lot of things that Google cannot answer, right? I mean, it tries to answer it, but it doesn't answer it properly at all. What is the meaning of life, Google? How should I, win the woman of my dreams? You ask these sorts of really important questions, and suddenly Google doesn't have very good answers and gets you in a lot of trouble. But we have to train our children that yes, we actually need to turn to the Bible for the most important answers, right? So, what are some signs of addiction, technology addiction? Constantly checking the phone. And by the way, look at this one stat here in the middle. On average, Americans check their phones 344 times per day. That's once every 4 minutes. So, constantly checking the phone, aimless clicking and scrolling, binge watching TV shows or short videos, social isolation or conflict, trouble focusing, difficulty sleeping, anxiety, or irritability. Um, Cal Newport is actually an MIT professor, or I'm sorry, he actually went to school at MIT. He's, I think, in Georgetown, but he wrote a book called Digital Minimalism. And he says that digital minimalism allows you to focus your online time on a small number of carefully selected activities that support things you value, then happily miss out on everything else. So what he suggests, and I really promote, is that we do a digital detox. And so digital detox basically has to do with taking 30 days and you fast from all non-essential screen time during that 30 days. And so this actually allowed, and so what, and I did this, was it last year or the year before? I think 2 years ago now. And what I did is I just chose like, okay, I have to use my computer for work. And then as far as like texting and phone calls, I actually really limited that. I gave myself strict rules, very strict rules during those 30 days. And I said exactly when I could use the apps, even like checking email. I was like, okay, I'm only going to check email at like lunchtime and then in the evening. And so I would batch things, right? And so during those 30 days, I essentially detoxed. And then towards the end, I was able to figure out what are the rules now moving forward, okay? And so it's important to have digital rules for ourselves, because otherwise technology can just creep in and take over more and more of our lives. And it's important to revisit those digital rules. And it's reminding me, even as I'm talking, like I need to go back and revisit, because otherwise, we can so easily allow technology to take over. And after the fast, we want to have less than 1.5 hours of non-essential screen time per day. So what can we do instead? Again, we don't want to just take things away and say that's bad. We want to point people to something better, right? So high quality leisure time. We can pick up a hobby. Maybe we can start fixing more things around the house, or learn crocheting, or I don't know what. Solitude. What about solitude? This is something that really is escaping us in a lot of ways in our culture today, isn't it? In other words, we just don't have time to be quiet. And I think this is a big part of the devil's plan. He's trying to get us so inundated with technology and noise that we have a very difficult time hearing his voice. And so we have to be very intentional with taking time for solitude. God says, "Be still and know that I am God." And a practical definition of solitude might be when our mind is free from input from other human minds, but of course still open to the divine mind, right? So we can have solitary experiences even, it doesn't have to be on a mountaintop, right? Time with friends and family, practicing the Choose Life Habits, that acronym that we have. Reading a book. Remember that? Like the old-fashioned books, they actually increase happiness, whereas digital reading is actually different. Explore a new hobby or interest. Detox benefits, enjoying simple pleasures again, having a more stable mood, deeper connection with others, enhanced ability to focus, more time for goals, and better sleep. I'm going to go a little rapidly over this part. I will be honest and say, with damaging music, I fully believe, and there are some studies that do show, some music is a lot better for the brain than others. But I will be frank and say it's hard to find really good studies in this music, and I've looked. There are some studies that are pretty decent, but to really so the best studies that I've actually found are the ones that on the positive effects. Well, actually, let me say it this way first on the damaging music one. So I have found some studies where they do show that certain types of music, like rock and rap music, can actually be linked to increased depression, anxiety, aggression, antisocial behavior, suicidal ideation, and substance abuse. Problem is, most of these are correlational studies, right? So if you want to get really academic, it's hard to convince somebody, okay? But some of the best studies, I think, are actually ones on classical music therapy, and there are some really good studies on that and how that actually enhances neuroplasticity, improves encoding, and actually better memory and cognitive processing speed as well. So especially Baroque classical music can be very beneficial for the whole brain and the frontal lobe specifically. So I wanted to talk a little bit about stress before we wrap things up. So again, I mentioned earlier, not all stress is bad, right? Look at this. I like this stress curve because it helps us understand this better. So if we have too little stress, what are we going to be? We're going to be inactive and lazy, right? Yeah, laid back. But here, this is actually right where we want to be, in kind of the yellow zone, if you will. And this is where our performance actually increases when we have a good amount of stress, because this can actually push us to get up in the morning, to go to work, to do a better job or whatever. So that's actually good. And it's just when we get too much of that chronic, ongoing high levels of stress that you start going to the exhaustion, anxiety, panic, anger, and eventually breakdown. Now, Kelly McGonigal, who's a Stanford health psychologist and lecturer, she wrote a book called The Upside of Stress. And she actually cites one study that I found really interesting, where they did a Gallup World poll of 125,000 people. And they asked them one question: did you feel a great deal of stress yesterday? And what was very interesting in the results of the study is that they found that the happiest people in the poll were what? Highly stressed, but not depressed. Why do you think that is? Why do you think the happiest people would actually be highly stressed? Yes. What's that? They overcame the stress. Yes, and most of the things that stress us out are what? Are things that also bring meaning into our life. Because our family stresses us out, right? Our kids stress us out. Our work stresses us out. But those are the very things that actually bring meaning into our life. So getting rid of stress is not the goal. The goal is actually learning to manage our stress in a healthy way. So what are some things that we can do to manage our stress in a healthy way? Well, exercise. Someone mentioned this earlier. Yes. What's really cool about exercise is that it actually does stress us. It increases cortisol. But what does that second bullet point say there? It increases cortisol, but what? Only transiently. So exercise actually lowers HPA axis reactivity, which gives us an attenuated response to stress. It also increases BDNF, which helps it be neurotropic, neurogenic, and neuroprotective. So the point being that small amount of short-term stress will actually make us more resilient to long-term stress. Does that make sense? So exercise is one of the best things we can do. And also, a lot of studies show, exercise really increases the frontal lobe almost instantaneously when you start exercising, doing cardio exercise. All right, and then I already mentioned learning to rest is a great way to deal with chronic stress. So take a day off once a week. And then another piece that's super important when it comes to managing stress, I like the analogy of a roller coaster, right? So is a roller coaster, was it stressful? If you ask someone, well, some people would say, yeah, I'm never getting back on that. And other people would be like, I want to go again, that was awesome. Same ride, what's the difference? Why are some people jazzed about getting back on that ride and other people are like, no way? It's how they perceive that stressor, right? And so Hans Salai, who was one of the early researchers on stress, he said, adopting the right attitude can convert a negative stress into a positive one. And he wrote a book called Stress Without Distress. And I'm going to actually, because of time, skip over. No, not this one. The next one. So we call that cognitive reappraisal. Basically, cognitive behavioral therapy will help in a big way when we're talking about reframing things. We're developing an internal locus of control, believing that we can and will overcome, and good will come out of it. And this is so much easier if people have that spiritual connection. So this is because of time, I'm just skipping over this. These are really cool studies, but you can read them in your handout. One important thing to understand, though, is that when we have too much stress, what happens? Remember, I said that the frontal lobe shuts down when you get too much dopamine, and also we said this earlier too, right? Too much adrenaline. And so it's great, cognitive therapy, like reframing, but that takes a frontal lobe, right? But if our frontal lobe is shut down in stress, how can we reframe? So then we're kind of in a catch-22, and this is where grounding can be really helpful. And so when I talk about grounding, I'm not talking about like some weird, said go into this trance and like have this Eastern meditation sort of philosophy. No. I'm talking about being present in the moment. I'm talking about decreasing that fight or flight activity, engaging the parasympathetic nervous system instead of the fight or flight, the sympathetic. And so there's lots of things you can do for that. Sometimes just breathing deeply for several minutes can be a great way. I mean, there's so many different grounding techniques. Sometimes just getting out into nature, connecting. Sometimes using what we call the 5, 4, 3, 2, 1 grounding technique. Acknowledge 5 things that you can see, 4 things you can touch, 3 things you can hear, etc. And again, that nature piece is a great way to ground. You have to understand when it comes to taking care of our mental health and our frontal lobe, if we have a troubled conscience, this will really impair our ability to think clearly. So acting outside of your moral values damages the frontal lobe and increases cognitive dissonance. Now, it is true, false guilt can also damage the frontal lobe. So there are people that are overly scrupulosity, and they have this false guilt, and that can also be harmful. Kind of a spiritual OCD, if you will. But true guilt also. So we need to, of course, distinguish. And how do we distinguish between true and false guilt? The word, right? And even Albert Ellis, who was one of the founders of cognitive behavioral therapy and was an atheist, and I think he may have even died an atheist, but he said, I think that I can safely say that the Judeo-Christian Bible is a self-help book that has probably enabled more people to make more extensive and intensive personality and behavioral changes than all professional therapists combined. And what about bitterness? Bitterness and resentment are toxic for mental health. Bitterness can involve ongoing rumination. We cannot think clearly if we're having all this junk going on in the background. It can involve the desire for revenge and or seeing only the worst in someone. Bitterness can prolong trauma symptoms and cause even more harm than the initial event. Resentment is associated with increased anxiety, shame, and depression. Actually, one psychologist, Peter Linden, he's recommended a new mental health classification called post-traumatic embitterment disorder because he's seen how terrible this is. So what is the solution? Well, the solution actually is forgiveness. Forgiveness has countless mental health benefits, but many people are afraid to forgive because they misunderstand what it means. They think it's just saying, hey, it's fine what you did to me. But that's not forgiveness, actually. Forgiveness is releasing bitterness and foregoing vengeance while still acknowledging the seriousness of the wrong. It's saying, I want the best for you, but it still, at the same time, it can include that you still hate the cruelty of the act. It's not forgetting. It's not excusing, and it's not reconciling. And that's really important to distinguish, because a lot of people say, I can't forgive them because, that means that they're going to just do it to me again. No, wait. What it is saying, I'm letting go of the right for revenge. I'm letting go of that anger that I want good for you. And I'm praying that God will actually bless you. And a big part of it has to be, I think, prayer, because true forgiveness does not come naturally to us as human beings. Even Christ, when he was on the cross and the Romans were crucifying him, did he say, I forgive you? No, what did he say? He said, Father, forgive them, for they know not. Now, he had to choose, but in his humanity, he asked for the power of God to forgive through him. Does that make sense? And that's what we can do as well. Again, it doesn't mean that we may never trust that person again. Trust is earned, right? Forgiveness is given, but we can let go. Because if we're bitter, we're actually keeping ourselves captive. Does that make sense? So, a story of forgiveness. Some of you maybe have heard of the October 2, 2006 shooting that occurred in the Amish one-room schoolhouse in Pennsylvania. And there was a gunman who actually shot 10 girls, and 5 of them ended up dying, and then he committed suicide. But what was beautiful is that the Amish community responded not in hatred, not in bitterness, but with love, with forgiveness. And actually, shortly, even within an hour, they were already comforting the shooter's family. And, it was amazing because even one of the grandfathers, either father or grandfather of one of those girls that died, actually, when the father of the shooter broke down and was just sobbing, he hugged him. And some reports say like even up to an hour, he comforted him. I mean, that kind of love we know only has to come from God. And 30 of the Amish people actually even showed up at the shooter's funeral. And here's a picture of the shooter's mother, and she said that love just emanated from them. It's a beautiful thing, a beautiful witness of God's power. And the final thing I wanted to mention was gratitude. I mean, I could spend a whole 20 minutes talking about this, but gratitude is such an amazing skill to enhance not only the frontal lobe, but our overall well-being. And people who intentionally cultivate gratitude show greater neural sensitivity in the medial prefrontal cortex. And what's really neat is that we can actually train ourselves to be more grateful. Because some people just feel like, some people are just naturally grateful, others aren't. No, we can actually train ourselves to notice what is good, what is beautiful. It takes intentionality, but the more you do it, the more easy it becomes. And do something simple like every time I brush my teeth, let me think of one thing that I'm grateful for. Just so associate it with things that you already do. And I couldn't talk about gratitude. I'm sorry, I'm already out over time, but I have to tell you one story about Grandpa, okay? If you'll bear with me, is that okay? All right. So this is a picture of Grandpa, Grandma, and then my mom. And this was actually, so this was back in 2009, a picture on my wedding day. My wife and I got married in Maui. We were Maui'd, as they say. And Grandma and Grandpa loved the Hawaiian Islands so much that they decided we want to extend our vacation. And so they actually went over to the Big Island, and they were spending some time over there. And Grandpa was driving his car one day, and he got T-boned by another car. Bam! And he suffered several injuries. He actually broke several ribs and fractured his pelvis. And he was in a great deal of pain. And he ended up in the hospital, and he was screaming out in agonizing pain. But Grandpa is very into natural means of healing, and he doesn't like medication, so he actually refused all pain medication. I'm not recommending that, but I'm just telling you the story, right? And so sometimes people would come to the hospital to visit, and he'd be screaming out in pain, and these visitors would go to the hospital staff, and they would say, I think that guy over there is really suffering. Maybe you should give him some medicine or something. And the staff would say, yeah, I'm sorry, that's Bernard. He's not willing to take any medications. There's not much we can do. So as soon as I found out that Grandpa got hurt, I called him on the phone, and I said, Grandpa, he answered, and I said, I heard you got in an accident. How are you doing? And Grandpa, he answered, and I could tell his voice was a lot more strained and tired than usual. He said, Daniel, I'm so grateful. Grateful, Grandpa. How are you grateful? And he said, I don't know how this is going to work out well, but I believe that God says all things work together for good. And what was beautiful as I watched him go through that experience is that so much good came out of that. And I think a lot of that was because of that attitude of gratitude. For one, my sister, who was up to that point an avowed atheist, called him and said, Grandpa, I'm praying for you. And for him, that would have been enough by itself. And then he also says that, when I was at the scene of the accident, that accident happened, there was a big stop sign that flashed through my mind, although there was no stop sign at the scene of the accident. And he took that as a sign to say, what, I want to stop. I want to reevaluate my priorities. I want to think about how I'm living my life and consider some changes. And so I share that story with you to encourage you because, we all have our issues. And it's easy to be grateful when things are going well. But God also wants us to rejoice, and Paul says, rejoice always. And again, I say rejoice. Why? Because with God, things really do work out for our ultimate good. But we have to give him room to work, right? And when we say, Lord, I don't get it, and this is painful, and I don't even like it, but I'm trusting that you can bring good out of this, we're setting the stage for amazing things to happen. And that's why we can truly, like Paul said, rejoice at all times. And so thank you so much for bearing with me. Even though I went over, I hope that that story was encouraging.